Hello and welcome to the Endurance Science Podcast with me, Matt Carpenter. The aim of this podcast is to cut through the endless noise and misinformation that social media presents us and discuss what the science really says about endurance performance. And we're starting this podcast off with a big one, electrolytes. I want to talk in this podcast about the science behind electrolytes, when we need them and when we don't, and disseminate the difference between what marketing and what supplement companies tell us compared to what is actually required. This is one that always brings a bit of controversy on social media, but it's one that it's hard to get the nuances out properly in. So I want to be able to talk in this podcast about what electrolytes are, why they look the way they do, and why most people don't need electrolyte supplements. But first, let me explain why I chose this topic for my first podcast episode. Well, I was at the National Running Show at the NEC in Birmingham yesterday, and I was absolutely swamped. We all were with electrolyte companies, but there was one tagline that really caught my eye and got me ranting to my wife. And whenever I rant to my wife, I decide that I have to post something on social media because otherwise I'll bore the life out of her. And that thing that really got me was that there was an electrolyte company marketing itself as a daily electrolyte drink. Now, I'll explain in this video why that frustrated me so much and why most people don't need electrolytes, but some people do. But what frustrates me is what I would consider misleading marketing that may even be negatively impacting someone's health. So let's talk about what electrolytes are, what they do, who should take them, and who shouldn't. So what are electrolytes? Well, there are a number of electrolytes in the body, and they're all charged ions with distinct physiological roles. The main ones when we're looking at endurance performance, particularly looking at electrolyte supplements, are sodium, potassium, and magnesium. And now, these all have different roles. We're going to dive into the role of all three of these when we come to performance and also health in this podcast. So sodium helps regulate fluid balance across your cell membranes. It helps maintain fluid balance within the blood and within the cell. And so it becomes particularly important when fluid balance is challenged, particularly when we look at things like long duration exercise or performance in the heat. Potassium itself is an intracellular electrolyte and it supports normal cell function. And magnesium is involved in over 300 chemical reactions in the body. You can already see how easy it is to market electrolytes based on the role of sodium, potassium, magnesium. But just like so many things when it comes to the world of supplements, just because these things are important in the body, it doesn't mean you need to supplement them. And this is something that I'll come back to over and over again. But very often within the world of supplements, particularly around sport and exercise, claims are made such as magnesium is responsible for over 300 enzymatic reactions. And the insinuation is that supplementing with magnesium will support those reactions. But for many people, if you're consuming sufficient magnesium, well, there's not that good evidence that adding more is going to help those reactions. It's very similar when you look at people or supplement companies that use vitamin B. So energy drinks are a really good example of this. You'll often see they've got a wide spectrum of the B vitamins, and then they'll use claims such as reduces tiredness, reduces fatigue, because that is what B vitamins contribute to. But there's no evidence that if your B vitamins are in a normal range, taking more is going to do that, but they still make those claims. So you can see here how easy to market these electrolyte drinks are. But when it comes to performance, what's going on? And more importantly, what is in your electrolyte drink? You'll typically find in an electrolyte drink that it's mainly sodium with a bit of potassium and a tiny little bit of magnesium. And now this firstly makes complete sense. And there's a good reason why it's created and they're formulated this way. But for the exact same reason, most people don't need an electrolyte drink. So let me explain. Your average electrolyte drink will contain around 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and very little magnesium. Some now are reducing the sodium content to 500 milligrams, but there's still a lot that use that higher range. And there's a good reason for this. When electrolytes were first sort of coming onto market, it was focused around long duration exercise. So scientists looked into what do you lose in your sweat? When you sweat, electrolytes are released from the body, and the main one is sodium. You'd be surprised to hear that the amount of electrolyte you're losing in your sweat mimics pretty closely the amount that is provided in a lot of electrolytes. That 1,000 sodium, 200 potassium, and then minimal magnesium reflects pretty nicely the amount of electrolytes you're losing in your sweat. And the same with calcium, minimal, which is why it's often not included. And so supplement companies came up with the idea of creating a supplement that helps you replenish the electrolytes you're losing in your sweat. All makes perfect sense and does have a use case. However, that use case is minimal. So we run into an issue. And the issue is that becomes important for ultra endurance events or events done in significant heat where your sweat rate is high. And so supplement companies came along and created electrolyte drinks that helped you replenish what you lost in your sweat. Now, this is really important in certain exercise modalities because particularly in the 80s and 90s, people were drinking more and more as extreme events were kind of becoming a thing. And hyponatremia cases increased massively. What is hyponatremia? Well, hyponatremia seemed to be coming on when people were consuming too much water relative to sodium intake. And what you got there was a massive reduction in your blood sodium levels and therefore an issue with water balance. Your blood became too low in sodium relative to water. So your blood plasma sodium concentration dropped too significantly. And this leads to a number of issues and can even be a cause of death. And so there was an issue there that scientists needed to try and come up against, which is how do we prevent hyponatremia? And actually the prevention is often fairly straightforward. It's to make sure you remain hydrated, not just with water, but with sodium as well to prevent that drop in your plasma sodium concentration. Now, this does make complete sense, but only in extreme endurance events, whether that be events that are prolonged or events that are in extreme heat. So there's a fantastic documentary about the Marathon des Sables. I believe it was James Cracknell that did it, and he ended up really ill. Great example of someone where electrolytes are extremely important. However, and there's a big however here, most people aren't running ultra endurance races. Most people aren't exercising in extreme heat. And yet electrolytes are marketed not just at ultra endurance runners now, but they're marketed at everyone. I was at the NEC for the National Running Show yesterday, and I saw a daily electrolyte supplement that contained 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And that really is the reason that I created or decided on this topic for today's podcast. Because to me, a daily electrolyte supplement that clearly was marketed at the mass running community is only going to make people less healthy. It's not even health neutral. A lot of supplements that don't work, you can kind of think, okay, they're not going to do any harm. Electrolyte supplements have the potential to do harm in some people. And the reason for this is quite simple. Sodium is one of the modifiable risk factors for heart disease. Well, that means it's one of the few things that you can control within your health to reduce your chance of cardiovascular disease. And the reason for that is the causal relationship that sodium has with blood pressure. So increased sodium concentration leads to a few things. It increases your blood volume by pulling water into the bloodstream. It can stiffen up your arteries, hence increase blood pressure to try and push through the arteries, and can also impact kidney function. And all of these things taken together leads to sodium being causally linked to cardiovascular disease. Now, the daily recommendation for salt intake in the UK is 6 grams. 6 grams of salt corresponds to around 2.4 milligrams of sodium. It's about a 40 to 60 ratio. So guidelines are about 2.4 milligrams of sodium per day. And now that's not an aim. That's a recommendation of an upper limit. Actually, the World Health Organization have a lower range. So 2.4 is actually fairly generous. And most people consume too much. So salt recommendations are 6 grams per day. The average salt intake in the United Kingdom is around 8 grams a day. So people are consuming 25% more salt than they should be already. The average person is over-consuming salt and therefore sodium relative to some fairly lenient NHS guidelines. One of the health benefits of running is that it can help reduce blood pressure. And one of the mechanisms is that because you're sweating out sodium, your sodium intake is therefore, by proxy, lower. So for the same sodium intake, you're actually losing sodium and therefore has a beneficial effect on your blood pressure. Electrolytes are a surefire way to completely prevent or stop, attenuate those benefits you're getting from exercise. And so rather than electrolytes being an important daily drink if you're a keen endurance athlete, they may well be making you less healthy. So let's talk about when electrolytes are needed and when they're not. So when we think about what a supplement is, people tend to supplement things they can't get in the sufficient quantities in day-to-day food and nutrition. The thing with electrolytes is that for almost everyone, you can get exactly what you need in your diet. You can get enough sodium. In fact, it's very easy. Like I've said, people already get too much, and you should be able to get enough potassium and magnesium. Now, this is where it gets slightly backward, at least in my mind, because most electrolyte drinks, like I mentioned, 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 potassium, minimal magnesium. Most people already consume, as we've discussed, too much sodium. But the inverse is true for potassium and magnesium. Most people don't consume enough potassium and don't consume enough magnesium. these electrolyte drinks are only making that problem worse because you're consuming loads of sodium and barely any potassium magnesium. RDAs for potassium are in and around the 3 gram mark between men and women. So that 200 milligrams isn't getting you much closer. You eat a nice baked potato, you're getting around 1,000 milligrams of potassium. So dietary changes are a great way to increase potassium content. Using a low salt instead of a regular salt, a table salt, is a great way of increasing your potassium level. But taking an electrolyte drink is a really bad way of increasing the amount of potassium you're getting. And the same with magnesium. The amount of magnesium you're getting in a supplement in an electrolyte drink is typically very, very low. As a result, it's doing nothing to help you get enough magnesium. Another thing that most people aren't consuming enough of. The best thing to do there is consume a magnesium supplement specifically rather than going for an electrolyte drink. But this is where supplement companies tend to get people, particularly electrolyte companies, because you can use the marketing claims of the benefits of magnesium, potassium, without actually helping people get closer to the goal of their daily amount of potassium or magnesium. And what's incredible there is that as you increase your sodium level, your risk of cardiovascular disease goes up. When you increase your potassium level, actually improves health markers. So people need more potassium and less sodium. And what electrolytes are doing is skewing that the wrong way. If you match potassium to sodium, it actually attenuates the rise in blood pressure that sodium induces. So what that means is if you were to take 500 milligrams of sodium by itself and compare it to 500 milligrams of sodium with 500 milligrams of potassium, that second group would have a lesser rise or maybe even no rise at all in blood pressure because of the impact of potassium. So people need more potassium, more magnesium, and less sodium. And electrolytes work in the inverse way. So there is no such thing as a daily electrolyte supplement. All that will do is make you less healthy, with the caveat that if you're exercising in the heat regularly, or if you're running beyond 3-4 hours a day regularly, then you may need to replenish sodium because you're losing sufficient amounts. So what we have there is really the idea that electrolyte supplements are very specifically beneficial for ultra endurance athletes during exercise and athletes that are exercising for prolonged periods of time in the heat. Now, sodium does have one other benefit that may be useful for some people. It stimulates thirst. And so some people may benefit from consuming sodium to induce thirst to make sure they're hydrated before exercise. However, a more efficient way to do this is to simply make sure that you are getting adequate sodium in your diet already, which most people are, and then making sure you're hydrating yourself with water. Electrolyte companies have done this very clever thing where they use the term hydration around their products. Well, the best way to hydrate yourself is to consume water. It's that simple. Again, caveat, if you're an ultra endurance athlete, then you do need that extra sodium. But for the vast majority of people, that extra sodium is absolutely not required. There's no good evidence that electrolyte consumption improves performance outside of ultra endurance exercise. And so this is where marketing and science are completely skewed. At the National Running Show, there were electrolyte companies everywhere. And being an electrolyte company isn't a bad thing. I have no problem with them at all. But you have to be very careful who you're marketing to. And this is where I really rate the work of people like Precision Fuel and Hydration, who I think are doing things the right way, where they focus on sweat rates and elite high-level athletes who are performing day in, day out, getting 10, 12, 14 hours of training a week. And at that point, there's a good case to make that you want to be making sure that your sodium levels are fairly consistent. And so it's important to know your sweat rate to be able to consume salt, sodium during pieces, during races, etc., etc. But the vast majority of companies, and it makes complete sense when you think about how marketing works, and as an industry grows, you need to target wider and wider audiences, you get to the idea of a daily electrolyte supplement, which to me is a surefire way to make exercise less beneficial. So that's why I have an issue with the world of electrolytes, and that's why I've made quite a few videos on my social media before about the idea of not needing electrolytes. And it doesn't mean that no one should touch an electrolyte. It means that if you're not an ultra endurance runner and you're not exercising in the heat, they're probably not for you. Now, it gets a little bit complicated, particularly here in the UK, when we think to marathon season, because it can get deceptively hot. I know last year's London Marathon was pretty warm, I think got 25, 26 degrees. And at that point, if you're running a 3-4 hour marathon, then it may be beneficial to add some salt into your drinks. And therefore, as a result, it may be useful to do it in training. But these things aren't things you need to do every session. You have long runs in your training for a marathon. That's when, if you want to prepare by adding an electrolyte capsule, electrolyte powders into your drinks, it's not a bad idea. You can also get carbohydrate drinks that contain appropriate amounts of sodium. So for a warm marathon, if you're a 3 to 4 hour marathon runner, then they might not be a bad idea at all. Again, it doesn't mean you need electrolytes. It means that there's some rationale for them, particularly if you're a heavy sweater and or a salty sweater. But for the vast majority of people, there's no need at all. But looking at electrolytes from more of a health perspective again, we can essentially rule out the role of sodium supplementation, because even people consuming healthy diets are very rarely under-consuming sodium. It had to be a very, very specific, precise diet involving almost no sodium to be under-consuming. But then what about potassium and magnesium? Well, the best way to get adequate potassium and magnesium is to focus on things like cruciferous vegetables. Potassium, like I've said, is abundant in things like potatoes as well. So trying to get it from dietary means is the best way to do it if possible. Magnesium can be a bit trickier, and magnesium supplementation I don't think is a bad thing at all. So when it comes to electrolyte supplementation, the only way I'd recommend it as a daily drink as such is to just consume some magnesium. And so let's finish this now by talking about when electrolytes are important. So there's some decent research that as you get into prolonged events beyond 4 hours, sodium ingestion will improve your performance, which makes complete sense since it will help you maintain plasma volume. And within that is going to help get delivery of nutrients to the muscle cells. And so you've got things like half Ironmans and above, or potentially fairly slow marathons, where sodium ingestion will improve performance. Now, even saying this, I'm saying sodium ingestion, you'll note, not electrolyte consumption. It's the sodium that's helping improve performance. And so you can see sodium as a performance electrolyte in those longer duration ultra events, 4 hours plus. You don't need necessarily to buy an electrolyte sachet that's costing a lot of money. You can do it yourself. You can home make it. You can add salt into your drinks, for example. You can buy things like salt sticks that are just salt. And so you don't have to buy an electrolyte even for the performance gains. I would suggest using salt for performance in those ultra endurance events, or if you're taking a daily drink, then you've got firstly trying to get your potassium magnesium through dietary means, or using a magnesium supplement to just make sure you're getting that added magnesium in, swapping out salt for low salt to increase your potassium intake. And so when we look at electrolytes, you see a huge difference between marketing and research. The evidence would suggest, in my view, that you do not want to be consuming electrolytes daily unless you're exercising 4 hours a day plus, which very few people are doing, or you're exercising regularly in extreme heat, again, for prolonged periods of time. If not, then you're getting perfectly sufficient amounts of sodium through the food you're eating to not need to supplement more. And if you want to improve your health, you should focus on getting sufficient magnesium, potassium, and calcium, and monitor sodium intake. And so that is the story of electrolytes. When you're looking at daily consumption, you do not need an electrolyte drink. When you're looking at performance, then sodium may be useful for events in extreme heat or for 4 hours and beyond. And when it comes to improving your health, you should, if anything, be looking to reduce sodium intake and increase magnesium and potassium levels. This can be done largely through dietary means, although magnesium supplementation can be useful. And if you know someone that's consuming electrolytes daily, then you're going to save them money and improve their health by encouraging them to stop. So be wise to the marketing of electrolyte companies. This doesn't mean electrolytes are bad. It's just about that important nuance that is often missed, particularly when marketing something like an electrolyte and trying to broaden its appeal. I hope this is interesting. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd love to know any feedback on these longer form pieces of work. I really enjoy making longer form content, so any feedback is always very helpful. Other than that, thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week.